Oh, yes.
I will talk really fast. In the introduction to his Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty proposes that contemporary wealth distribution is everyone's concern. He states the distribution of wealth is too important an issue to be left to economists, sociologists, historians, and philosophers. It is of interest to everyone. The concrete physical reality of inequality is visible to the naked eye and naturally inspires sharp but contradictory political judgments. Peasant and noble, worker and factory owner, waiter and banker, each has his or her own unique vantage point and sees important aspects of how other people live and what relations of power and domination exist between social groups. And these observations shape each person's judgment of what is and is not just. However, in our increasingly mediated world, the individual's belief systems, ideology, and judgment of contemporary economic policy and wealth distribution are shaped by and conditioned by the media we consume. This paper explores how the Marvel Cinematic Universe and comic universe relates to popular attitudes to economic policy. In particular, this paper explores how the Spider-Verse narratives shape and inform how peasant and noble, worker and factory owner, waiter and banker, as Piketty says, sees important aspects of how other people live and what relations of power and domination exist between social groups. After the 2008 financial crisis, US and British banking systems feared a lack of confidence in their respective economies. In traditional Keynesian economics, banks can raise and lower interest rates in order to stimulate savings or spending and artificially regulate the economy. In the context of neoliberalism, banks have been reluctant to implement such Keynesian economic structures as manipulations. Instead, in 2009, the central banks of England and America introduced something called quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is an economic tool that is seen as separate from economic regulation. The aim of quantitative easing is to inject money into the economy in order to revive nominal spending. The bank is doing that by purchasing financial assets from the private sector. When it pays for those assets with new central bank money, in addition to boosting the amount of central bank money held by banks, it also is likely to boost the amount of deposits held by firms and households. This additional money then works through a number of channels discussed later to increase spending. This is all in Benford et al. Describing quantitative easing. But in quantitative easing, the banks release more currency, more of the thing that's desired into the economy at the risk of inflation by purchasing bonds and stocks in order to stimulate faith in that economy, promote spending, and consequently stimulate growth. But quantitative easing could spur inflation. So quantitative easing proposes that a calculated quantity of product restores faith in that product. Give more to make people want more. It's counterintuitive. In 2021, the 9th Spider-Man film in 20 years was being prepared for release. However, there was a recognition that with so many superhero films, audiences may be losing interest in that superhero narrative and that particular spider product. The anxiety was that the overproduction of that product, Spider-Man, there is a risk of alienating the audience and result in a failure in the public to invest in the product. So the solution is what I'm calling spider quantitative easing. To combat falling interest, the devaluing of Spider-Man by overproduction of Spider-Man, they released more Spider-Man and created the Spider-Verse narratives. So this film, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, 2018, and Spider-Man No Way Home, both use the conceit of multiple iterations of Spider-Man in the same film. This can be understood as a form of quantitative easing. Restore confidence in the property not by restricting supply, but by flooding the market with a calculated amount of product in order to restore interest in said product. We can see in the latter film's marketing campaign the conjoining of the different ages of Spider-Man through the paratextual fact of bringing back former actors who played Spider-Man was a significant hook to bring in potential audiences. More, the original actors were slight variations of the Spider-Man suit that reflects their cinematic era's iteration of the character. Part of the pleasure in No Way Home is watching the ways the different actors, directors, and production designers of the past realized the character of Spider-Man in the previous films. Both No Way Home and Into the Spider-Verse were major successes, earning a combined $2.3 billion in global ticket sales. But these two film franchises were not the first time the Spider narratives were deployed, the Spider-Verse narratives were deployed to consolidate audience interest and purchasing power. The use of spider quantitative easing begins in the Marvel comic universe with the ambitious storyline Edge of Spider-Verse, which ran from 2014 to 2015. Now, I'm not going to tell you too much about the Bronze and Silver Age of comics. You know this, but as the comics started going into new ages, they were looking for new ways of marketing the comics. And in the 80s, we start getting a bit more fragmentation as audiences start going into their preferred comics. So there was a time when kids would just walk into a comic store and be casual buyers of comics. We see that there is a more streamlined and more kind of specialized market. So by the modern age of comics, 1985 to present, comic characters started to fragment. As different editors or writers would helm a comic line that would create new villains or situations that resulted in permanent change to a character, famously beginning with the death of Gwen Stacy, that's already been mentioned in 1973. Later writers would begin to tell the story again with the character returned to the storyline. By the early 2000s, Spider-Man had been retconned, rebooted, died, been reborn, and recreated variously as several clones, a symbiote, a black teenager, and a Mexican-Irish scientist living in the year 2099. Such fragmentation inevitably led to comic inflation and alienation from the product. So these narrative strands and contradictions resolved in this ambitious multi-comic project that would span several months and several different comic titles. But we might ask, how can one organize and clear these reboots, retcons, tie-ins, and characters, how to rationalize death and rebirth, how to ensure consumption of a fragmenting storyline, how to restore confidence in an inflated product? Designed by Dan Slott and beginning in August 2014, the event ran across 6 different comic titles until February 2015. In order to untangle this web of narrative confusion, comic purchasers would have to buy all issues of all 6 comic lines for a period of 6 months to untangle the web. The storyline proved tremendously successful, resulting in several films that parallel the comic book event. But is this marketing or is this ideological? Francis Fukuyama, in his 1992 work, The End of History and the Last Man, proposes that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the world was entering a new era marked by the end of ideology. Fukuyama argued that with communism acting as a counter-ideology to American liberalism and the fall of communism, there was no further need for use of ideology with a single ideology taking over the world. Jacques Derrida, however, counters Fukuyama in Spectres of Marx, arguing that rather than the end of ideology, there is now an era steeped in ideology. He says, never have violence, inequality, exclusion, famine, and thus economic oppression affected as many human beings in the history of the earth and of humanity. Instead of singing the advent of the ideal of liberal democracy and the capitalist market in the euphoria of the end of history, instead of celebrating the end of ideologies and the end of great emancipatory discourses, let us never neglect this obvious macroscopic fact made up of innumerable singular sites of suffering. No degree of progress allows one to ignore that never before, in absolute figures, have so many men, women, and children been subjugated, starved, or exterminated on the earth. So Derrida considers 10 giant evils, or what he calls the 10 plagues of the modern world, and he proposes that no one working in media or the arts can be working without the knowledge of these material facts. And such knowledge of unemployment, homelessness, economic war, the contradictions of the free market, foreign debt, the arms industry and trade, proliferation of nuclear weapons, interethnic war, and the contradictions in international law and social problems that face the 21st century are in every artist or writer's context. So Derrida proposes that these plagues filter into all contemporary literary and political works. Spider-Man 2 as a text cannot de-link itself from this political ideological context. Working from Derrida, the economist Thomas Piketty, he proposes that a singular ideology, neoliberalism, is taking hold around the world. Further, Piketty proposes that inequality is not a natural state of being, that it's structured, constructed, and actively driven by those who engage in contemporary forms of capitalism. In short, inequality is always driven by ideology. While Piketty proposes that ideology drives inequality, it must be recognized how ideology is transmitted. In order for ideology to become a worldview, it must be accompanied with ideological texts that pave the way for a society's worldview. So we start to see contradictions in texts. The texts may be on the surface critiquing economic inequality, but they are also a consumer product that is requiring people to purchase that product and engage in capitalism. So Althusser, in his book Lenin and Philosophy, proposes that there are 2 structures that a society uses to impose its worldview. Repressive state apparatuses, that is church and schools and prison systems and courts and legal systems, and they use violence or the threats of violence to coerce people into believing in the systems, jails, fines, those sort of things. But then there's also the ideological state apparatuses. And these can be coterminous with the RSAs, the church, governments, laws, legal structures, and schooling, which in tandem with the threat of violence also instruct the population into certain worldviews. But the ISAs, the ideological state apparatuses, also include the family structure, the media, music, and entertainment industries, which similarly espouse the values and worldviews of the ruling class. For Althusser, there is no paradox between the state and private enterprise sharing the same ideological system, for the values of the ruling class are the values of society. For Althusser, the media cannot operate without the consent of the government, and the government cannot rule without the consent of the media. And so whether private or state-owned, the values of the ruling class will be the dominant ideology. This is what Gramsci describes as hegemony. So, Spider-Man and acquisitive capital, how does it rationalize the contradictions between being anti-capitalist and being capitalist? So it's clear from earlier discussions that Marvel Comics and Spider-Man are a corporate property that has tremendous economic value. But we're in an era where participants in capitalism are becoming alienated by its negative effects. The discontents of capitalism, or what Derrida describes as the great evils, are everywhere. So how does Marvel both address the discontents of capitalism while interpolating its subjects back into consumer capitalism? Marvel Comics' value comes from its widespread appeal, and it works actively to create strategies to sell its product, like these adventurous comic lines. So it's selling to as wide an audience as possible, including an audience that is disenfranchised from capitalist processes. As argued previously, the Spider-Verse narrative was an attempt to consolidate a fragmented and increasingly alienated audience into a single storyline. Skipping. So Anne Allison, in an article on Pokemon, describes the play and logic of the child's computer game from the 90s. In the article New Age Fetishes, Monsters and Friends, Pokemon Capitalism in the Millennium, Allison argues that Pokemon as a text is structured around acquisitive capitalism, with its catchphrase Getto Suru, or in English, gotta catch 'em all. Pokemon is an allegory of contemporary acquisitive growth. Capitalism, Allison says, is both mimicked and reconstructed in the forms of play, while consumption engaged by Pokemon. While conforming to a pre-existing market economy, Pokemon also pushes it in new directions, what I call here only half facetiously Pokemon capitalism. In short, Pokemon is training or indoctrinating children into being good capitalist subjects who actively engage in structures of capitalist growth, what Gramsci describes as hegemony and Althusser describes as hailing or interpolating. So the story of the Spider-Verse comic event follows a similar narrative of acquisitive capitalism. Within the story, a family of vampiric totems, creatures that derive their power through a form of cannibalism, you are what you eat, target Spider-Man and his multiverse variants as their particular source of food and power. Using a variant Spider-Man who can weave a thread that links together different worlds in the multiverse, the inheritors traverse the multiverse, eating and gaining the power of each world's version of Spider-Man. They are a perverse form of collector, intent on eating all the spiders in the universe and demonstrating a gross parody of consumer capitalism. The narrative within the narrative constructs their excessive consumption as grotesque, satisfying the growing anti-capitalist sentiments of the readership, right? Consumption is grotesque. And yet, ironically, while the inheritors are performing that grotesque parody of consumer capitalism, each storyline introduces new worlds with new aesthetic styles and new Spider-Men, Spider-Woman, Spider-Pigs, and variants for the inheritors to attack, begging the question, will this spider variant be eaten, never to be seen again? So the comics then replicate the perverse acquisitive consumption model that the inheritors engage in. Audiences are trained into desiring to purchase each week a new comic that will introduce a new Spider-Man variant with potentially new powers or different iterations of the Spider-Man trope, perhaps turning invisible, having 6 arms, or being a spider-monkey hybrid. Moreover, by allowing different writers and artists to contribute to the Spider-Verse narrative, each episodic element may be drawn in a different comic style, with each world of the multiverse having its own law of physics and reality. And each week there's a new peril. By creating a multiverse in which there are millions of potential spider beings, death is never far away, and audiences are encouraged to keep consuming to discover which spider variants will survive and which will not. And so the inheritor's acquisitive narrative parallels that of the reader's consumption habits, feeding their own morbid curiosity and discovering new characters who will do battle with the inheritors, and wondering which characters within the collection will survive the ordeal and perhaps earn their own spin-off title. So while superficially the comics are constructed as a critique of overconsumption, the text serves to hail its readers back into that process of acquisitive capital consumption, indeed opening the Spider-Verse to infinite possibilities. The comic line, rather than providing coherence to the pre-existing spin-off characters, proves to have the opposite effect, creating an entirely new range of spider figures, each with their own potential comic line and audience appeal that is shaped by narrative construction, but also figurative style. There's Peter Porker, Spider-Ham for young audiences. But there are also noir Spider-Men, dark Spider-Men, and sundry Spider-Girls and women, each with a potential storyline that can be followed. In the end, the Spider-Verse is presented as a multitude of infinite worlds and infinite possibilities. Within the Spider-Verse, the comic writers and artists can reconfigure even the laws of physics and reality as we understand it. There's even a multiverse world where sentient cars fight crime and ordinary sedan Peter parked car turns into the spider buggy to fight villains. And yet, in every world, the inherent ideology is one of acquisitive growth and Darwinian survival of the fittest. Competitive biological red economic model. That is, within the Spider-Verse, the writers can conceive of any combination of physical or cultural worlds, and yet in every single one of them, the inherent ideology remains the same, that of consumptive capitalism. And that is